Okay, so this morning some of you would have been here and you heard a lot about modelling and how to do runoff coefficients and guidelines, what guidelines exist. So we at the City of Gosnells, we basically had the advantage of water-sensitive urban design existing. We started about 10 years, 15 years ago, and we now looked at what really happened on site, and can we now calibrate a model for this water-sensitive urban design so that it helps us inform future decision-making. So that's the new thing really that we've done. You hear about models, but we calibrate traffic models, we put classifiers out on the road, but we don't seem to be doing it with stormwater management. We trust the results that the model spits out, what the consultants tell us, and we develop the urban fabric. So we basically believe we need to go back to basics. We need to really say, if we do those things, they have to have a sound foundation, and we need to get more information, more monitoring, more modelling to inform future decision-making. The study area is in Canning Vale, was ripe for urbanisation back in 1999. The planners and the engineers had a bit of a quarrel about it. The planners won with their state-of-the-art water-sensitive urban design approach, as we now know it. In the past it was called living stream concept or more sustainable drainage approach and things like that. So you would have seen this before, the natural water balance in a natural catchment, a lot of evapotranspiration, a lot of infiltration. This was the traditional engineering approach to drainage, and now we've got this new water-sensitive urban design approach with a lot of evapotranspiration again and trying to mimic the natural pre-development circumstance. So the key point I would like to point out here is that the rainfall is mostly evapotranspirated or infiltrated in the soil and natural catchments. Now, our study area is the central Canning Vale area. This is shown up here, pre-development conditions. So there wasn't a lot of housing there, a lot of bushland. All the black stuff is trees and things like that. Nurseries, agricultural uses in this area. And we set out on the living stream concept, so there's a living stream running right through it, designed by consultants. So we had a drainage and nutrient management plan, it was called at the time, and a conceptual drainage strategy to guide the implementation of this overall concept. The critical aspect here is, and what I'm saying from here on, it applies mainly to high water table areas. So if you've got constrained territory, which is former wetlands with a high water table close to the surface, this is what I'm talking about. There might be some lessons for the other guys that are in Wanneroo or more on the sandy soils, but really we are talking about high water table or perched water table in urban development in those areas. It's very valid for the Murray, Peel, Serpentine, Armidale, the Woogong area where development is progressing at the moment. So the issue here was we had a bottleneck when the development took off. There was a constraint imposed by the Hugh Street branch drain. The Water Corporation is managing that, and they said our drain is designed so it goes under industrial developments and so on where it's piped. They said our drain is designed to cater for the pre-development flow of 1.13 litres per second per hectare in the 10-year event. So that's the permissible peak flow rate in the 10-year event, and from there on we have to manage the water in the urban fabric. So the site, 135 hectares, you do the sums, you come up with 150 litres per second, which is about 15 buckets of water that are allowed out at maximum from this development area. So it doesn't sound a lot if you think 135 hectares. There is a bit more contributing here from upstream, so that's why I put plus 135. So we haven't quantified that exactly at this point in time. So that's what it looks basically now, pre-development, post-development. There's still some land parcels which are up for grabs, ripe for development in here and here and here. We've since built a basin in here. This is a natural bushland which needs to be retained. So, but we are at the end. We're pretty much at the end of the build out of this this catchment. But something went wrong. We came along, great usability value of a park. if it looks like that in winter. So that was started off around about 2007, 2008. So urban development commenced in 2000 roughly, and 2007, 2008 things looked like that. Something was fishy. I point out two, and I probably should quickly go back. We go to two sites. This is the Auckland Parade Detention Basin, and this is the Peasley Detention Basin here. And I'll give you just, actually this is Peasley Basin as well. So this is what it looked like on the ground, and that's what it looked like from the aerial view. July 2009. The park in itself had a constructed lake in here with a footpath around, and then there was another footpath and sort of where people could wander in circles in the park to enjoy themselves. That didn't happen in that winter. And in September it still didn't happen. The water that was sitting around got really quite anoxic. Algae started growing. In October, well, still no great recreational value. And by December the whole thing had dried up. Left us with a dead patch of turf, and people could come back in. So by January the turf had grown back. The lake was back in its banks, but by May already we had issues again. Continued, same thing next year, August 2010. Sorry, sounds strange. So basically, same occurrence over 2 years. We did everything to maintain the drainage system, and we had this key issue. So then we went across to the other basin, and I'll run you through very quickly, but the same thing applied. The water table came up in May. August it was still hanging around. Late August, September the park started drying up again. October people could kick a footy. That's sort of what it looked like on the ground. Great recreational value, probably good for growing rice, but not for having a picnic. So all that, what I just showed you, is with a background of the driest winter since records started in WA. So, records commenced in 1900. The 2010 winter was the driest on record, had a below average July. So you'd expect, if everything was designed properly, why do we have that problem? So luckily, as things happened, we set out to install monitoring bores. So we established a monitoring program at 6 locations. We even did one after some searching. Someone volunteered to let us put something in their soak wells in their backyard after we found them. And so there's 90 monitoring devices out there measuring flow, groundwater levels, as well as rainfall. So the 19 sites to date have performed quite well, and there's Kieran Coop here from Numero. He has actually delivered that service to the city. Great job so far. This is unfortunately the catchment boundaries dropped off, but this is the catchment now sort of looking in another direction. But basically we're talking about this area in here, and this just shows you the monitoring sites, how they're distributed throughout the constructed catchment. So keeping that in mind, we had monitoring information. We were now the idea was to calibrate a model and to really look at what happened on the ground. Can we model the urban fabric so that we can better improve it in the future? So calibrate that model. But also it raised a number of research questions: what happened on site, the flooding, the problems people experienced. And the monitoring program hopefully did help us so far to answer some questions, but it's still early days in terms of the model calibration. So I'll just run through a couple of questions now that we posed that might help you as well. And as we go through, I'll give conclusions to each of those questions, and you might take them away. So the key thing was, what was the relationship between the design groundwater levels and what we observed on site? So it was quite obvious, it didn't look right, but can we, through the monitoring, demonstrate something was wrong? So we had those 19 sites, and I think there's about more than half of them have groundwater loggers installed. We monitored about a half a metre rise across the whole catchment between the design, AAMGL at the time, and this is now the actual measured level, the peak level throughout the winter. So you can compare the two, because at the end of the day, this is AMGL. If you're on the driest year on record, you should be way below that AMGL. But we are 500 millimeters above. This is one example here, so that shows you the records throughout the year. Groundwater levels taken at every day, all through telemetry, so you can log on and look it up whenever you like. We had a 1.2 meter variation across the year, so it was just not a lot of variation. Tells you it's a shallow water table catchment. But in this particular case, we had an 800 millimeters difference at this point in time, at the 12th of July 2010. And later on you might hear Jim Davies talk about that date, because that's when he recorded the peak in the Wugong area on his subsoil drains. So I'm just flagging that. It seems to be a regional, that day was a significant peak day for that winter. About 800 millimeters difference. So even if you take out the short-term peaking for that rainfall event in here, you sit somewhere at level 22. The design was 21.5, ties in with the average of half a meter above AMGL in the driest year record. So our conclusion is really, once again, strategic master plans must reflect post-development changes in groundwater environment following urbanization, both regionally and on local scale. You need to probably put in some monitoring to be able to dynamically reflect what goes on throughout the year and as developments progress, so that you can adjust certain things potentially. And then policies and guidelines are required to assist practitioners in appropriate decision making, hinting at urban development in high groundwater table areas. We don't have the good science to really know what's going on. So next thing was, we had fragmented land ownership in that catchment. We thought, did that actually contribute to the flooding problems that we experienced out there? Initially, there was a large agricultural open drain right through the spine of the catchment. In the design conceptual approach, it wasn't actually intended to maintain that. The planners and their corridors became a bit too narrow. It wasn't really possible to create a broad, wide living stream with big floodplains and so on to accommodate the depth of that open drain. And also in the interest of maintaining the impact of fill, sort of minimizing fill requirements, basically the idea was to just have that as a living stream throughout the catchment and filling in that agricultural drain. So development occurred right here in the middle first. It was cutting off that agricultural drain and the flows from upstream. Ideally, it should have occurred from way up here and then moved its way down, but that's not the reality of development. So the idea came up in 2002 or 2001 thereabouts to put a low flow pipe under this a multiple use corridor and the swale drain that was there. So that was quite good, and the low flow pipe solved the problem of fragmented land ownership because the water was still able to drain through that low flow pipe. An agricultural drain could be retained further upstream. But the problem is the whole catchment, 2.8 kilometers, is the spinal length of that multiple use corridor. We've only got 2 meters of grade, or at the hydraulic design grade line, basically 0.07%. That's the hydraulic grade across the entire catchment. It is there to meet the Water Corporation's peak permissible discharge of 150 litres per second, which so far from our monitoring we can say is done pretty good. But it has a major issue on its performance, maintenance requirements. A flat pipe like that is very difficult to maintain. You've got to be really on top of it to keep it clean. The other thing was really, if you've got a flat catchment like that, how do you actually construct a functional subsoil drainage system? Unless you start filling left, right and centre to lift things up. But with this flat grade line, flows are very slow. You know, you're struggling to get the water away from a subsurface environment. So from our perspective, strategic master plans have to accommodate for that fragmented land ownership, and it's probably what occurs in most urban development areas at the moment. And find a way to deal with the drainage so that it does not increase the risk, the fragmented land ownership, the risk for flooding in the future. So next issue we had, and Jim touched on that this morning, was the runoff coefficients, or let's say runoff, and not talk about coefficient, managing the runoff. what is actually the runoff that we have to deal with. Was the design aligned with the physical reality of urban development? And I've got three things that I want to point out to you, which sort of have creeped up over the years. Originally, the whole catchment was based on R17.5 residential density. It then very quickly went to R20, and then throughout the years now we're moving further and further, R30, R40, R60, and so on. So the planners have done a good job in meeting all those great planning disasters here. But at the end of the day, no one went back and looked at the drainage and say, well, can we actually do that? Because half the stuff is already constructed. We've got constraints downstream. What do we need to do to make this work? So that's the number one. Number two, our houses are getting bigger. And in 2009, on average, all the new dwellings, the footprint was 215 square meters. For freestanding houses, that was 245 square meters. That was the footprint of a residential dwelling on average in Australia. We are world leaders in building big homes. So we're getting smaller blocks, but we're building bigger homes. What does that mean for drainage? And then came the water restrictions and environmental issues and so on. So no regard for where you are, whether you're in a shallow water table catchment or not. Sprinkler bans were applied. People rolled out technological progress, desert landscaping, and this stuff here, which is really good for drainage because you've got cracker dust underneath. See, the stuff blocks up. It's got a major impact on drainage and then on evaporation from the subsurface sands. So if you combine the three, this is pictures taken in Canning Vale in our catchment. That's what things look like. Just note the house. There's the same house with a red door, but same landscaping. Must be a package. Similar story here. Artificial turf, paving, no trees, no nothing. Minimum water requirements here. Nice big driveways. Those were the higher density lots, basically. All the verges even paved. We allow them to pave up to a third under the local law, so it'd be interesting to figure out whether that is actually up to 2/3. I'll have to do that right. So 1/3 still should be pervious. Triple garages are creeping up left, right, and centre, and basically that's the physical reality of suburbia. No trees, paved. Bringing you back to that statement, rainfall is mostly evapotranspirated or infiltrated into the soil natural catchments. We've done a good job with water-sensitive urban design where we can control it. But over here, there's the physical reality, what people demand, what they do in their backyard, we can't control. Triple garages, the system allows it. We can't say, you can't have that. You have a narrow 1 meter driveway and you can have a triple garage. Doesn't work. So we believe that the amount of hard surfaces in the catchment at the moment is between 65 to 70%. You might think, okay, when I take the broader regional catchment, that goes down a bit. But for drainage, my subcatchment is important because that subcatchment drains to my system, drains to the park down the road. I'm not interested what it is on a regional scale. I'm interested on my actual drainage catchment. So just a few snapshots. 1999, 2.25 hectare site. 2003 developed at R20, 27% area potentially pervious available in that catchment, and that includes half the road reserves when we did this calculation. Similar here, R17.5, now you think, should be a bit better. It's only 22%. So there's no direct relationship at those kind of densities, but the sign is clear. 1999, once again now 2004, we've got an R30 site down here, an R40 site in 2010 on the other end. So guess what? 16%. That's the amount available for evapotranspiration, infiltration of rainfall, potentially if those people don't put other stuff down that we haven't actually seen from the aerial photo. So now coming to the soak well, and we're talking runoff. We did the monitoring program on a property, residential property. So this just shows you a graph of 3 soak wells. So the guy actually, 600 square meter block, he had 3 soak wells. He had 1,500 diameter by 1,200 deep, which is actually more than what most people have out there. we monitored the thing. 14 millimeters rainfall in a day. So the peak rainfall, maximum hourly rainfall was 3.75 millimeters. That's the less than the 1 year, 1 hour that Bill Till was talking about this morning. This guy tries storing it within the catchment. So day one, the rainfall. So this line, I'm shaking a bit, sorry. This line here is the rainfall graph. And this stuff is basically what happens in the soak well as the water fills in. So there's 3 different lines for 3 different soak wells. But basically after the day, even throughout the day already, the thing surcharged. It didn't actually infiltrate into the ground anymore. It had an overflow and the water went out on the road. So runoff, yes, it's great to look at surfaces, but you also need to look at the performance of your on-site drainage measures. If they don't work as designed, if they can't cope even with a basic 1 year hour event, the whole thing goes belly up and you have a lot more water that you need to manage. Time of concentration might be thrown in, but we haven't got any signs. We haven't got an idea how long, this was a one day rainfall, we need more information about those things. And I think we're the first ones that have monitored soak wells on private property.
Where was the groundwater table in those?
So the groundwater table, that's the interesting bit here. The groundwater table already was sitting in the base. So they put in 1.5 meters of fill at the time, which was the standard based on the AMGL, which should have been way down there. Now the AMGL has come up, so there's no separation anymore because you're talking about 500 mil water tables come up. We usually say you should have half a meter to the AMGL so that your soak well works. Well, in this case, given the regional changes, water table was sitting in the base, that's in May, and it basically went back down to that level, but it took 3 days or 2 days, depending on which soak well you look at, to get rid of the water. So quite an interesting insight which you should take into consideration. So our conclusion is that the design of runoff coefficient must better account for the reality of impervious surfaces or the urban development as it ultimately exists. There is one more thing I haven't touched on. We talked about water infiltrating, initial losses were mentioned today. We went out there during a rainfall event. You've got a 2% grade on your verges. If you talk about the first events in the year, which can actually be quite short, sharp, heavy events, the initial wetting took so long with those hydrophobic soils that the water ended up on the road. It didn't actually infiltrate. The initial loss didn't exist. If at all, it was minor. So only where you had an area to let the water pond, then after a while you could see bubbles coming up and, the air was getting out of the soil and it started infiltrating. But it took a reasonable amount of time to do that because we had to go out from the office to the site to see the flooding, to see what's going on the ground. So the short, sharp events, they might not be, significant in terms of the overall volume, but everything runs down to the low point and the system can't cope with it. So it needs more signs around that. Total water cycle balance, did one exist for this catchment? In short, it wasn't really the big thing that was talked about back in '99. We were state of the art back then. We were smarter these days, but back then, total water cycle balance wasn't really the target. The target was environmental issues, pollutant and nutrient management. So none existed really. It wasn't taken into consideration as far as I can see. So the issue here, this is from CSIRO. They looked at evaporation losses from the shallow water table. If your groundwater table is closer to the surface, so that's the distance from the surface, your evaporation rate goes up. Basically, the evaporation losses play a major role in the areas of a shallow water table. We've seen that from Bill before. CSIRO is saying the evaporative losses, if you urbanize, drop by 60%. So keeping in mind the higher rate of evaporation from the shallow water table, about 90% in pre-development, if that drops by 60%, you are in trouble if you haven't allowed for it. nothing in those guidelines really points you in the direction of how to do a proper water balance, how to account for evaporative losses. I'm yet to see a consultant that does it properly. I think there's one firm in Perth who does it quite well, but I haven't actually seen any documents from them. So we need more guidance and science around that, so that consultants know what they do. Winter sprinkler ban didn't help either. Usually you could put a garden bore in and you could mimic this evaporation losses from the surface or evapotranspiration for putting the water on your lawn, but people weren't even allowed to do it, even though there is not even a need to do it. So water cycle assessments should be undertaken in those shallow water table areas, and the evapotranspiration losses, you knock out the trees, you put on houses, you seal the area, that needs to be accounted for. If you haven't seen it in a document, you make sure you ask the consultants, show me what the water cycle balance is. Short-term groundwater variability. We figured out on the monitoring within the 1 month, we had a variability in the water table of 0.2 meters, so that's your mounding. But the interesting bit is the mounding is consistent across the catchment, and we even had up to 0.5 meter mounding in some areas that we've monitored. So 0.5 meter can be quite significant. If it only disappears after a month, how are your soak wells going to work during that point in time? Yeah, and that's probably the 0.5 meter ties in a bit with the mounding above the AMGL. So we believe continuous monitoring needs to be implemented so that people understand better, or we're monitoring of existing open fabric, so that if we develop new land, we can better calibrate our models and we can account for the mounding, and we understand the variability in the groundwater table and what the impact is on lot drainage. How much time have I got left? Well, I started late. No, I've got left, I can see. So further things we looked at were basins, AMGL-based design on basins. The outlets were to be set at the AMGL, which straight away means your downstream systems are submerged. So this is that low flow pipe under the multi-use corridor. Pipe is submerged. Basins don't perform that well because they have to deal with backwater. Wasn't allowed for in the design. So once again, groundwater needs to be accounted for in the shallow water table areas, and the basin needs to allow for that backwater impact. And there's at the moment very little guidance, technical guidance around. Functional subsoil drainage system, I said in the beginning, we didn't really have one. Even if we had one, the regional water table comes up, your subsoil drainage system is here. Doesn't make a difference. The system basically goes underwater, it doesn't really work. That's just the view again through the corridor. So if you've got your water table coming up, the parks are going underwater, your subsoil drainage system is underwater. So the safety factor in this case wasn't there. And what would it have been? It would have been more fill, and that comes at a cost. So it's a big question that I throw to the audience, how do we solve it? So regional changes, once again, in the groundwater table environment will have to be considered, and the policy framework should consider that and reflect that. And I believe tomorrow Department of Water is talking about groundwater, managing groundwater environments. Last point, what mechanisms did we have in place to review the drainage concept from start, the drainage approach? It wasn't really spelled out that we needed to do that. We are not the specialists. Developers did it at their local scale. Each subdivision continued, and they looked at their side, the water table on each side. But from a strategic perspective, there was no review done. The concept was in place for 10 years. Planners went about and mixed it up and threw in even more things. State agencies signed off. No one ever raised the question, do we need to actually go back to basics and review the concept? So we were like that. Developers went ahead and we just watched. So we're not skilled, and we believe trigger points need to be set in a strategic document that clearly sets out when do you need to do a review of the concept. State agencies are assigned that role at the moment. Department of Water, in the Better Urban Water Management Policy, it says they have that responsibility. They haven't done it. So to be continued, we've got more land basically down here in Southern River, shallow water table environment, and as I said initially, Wugong and so on. So I'll go through those conclusions pretty quickly. we need increased attention to research for urban development in shallow water table areas. Basically looking at groundwater level control and impact of urbanization on the water balance. If not, we go like that. We have no data to calibrate our models. We can talk about coefficients, we can talk about stuff like that, we can talk about policy, but shit happens, we don't get the outcome.